The year is 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, stands at the head of the largest European army ever assembled. The Grande Armée, over 500,000 strong, a multilingual, multinational force, marches east. Their target, Moscow. Napoleon believes that by capturing Russia's ancient capital, he can force Tsar Alexander I to his knees and bring the entire continent under his unquestioned control. What could possibly go wrong? The invasion begins in June. The Russians, under the command of General Barclay de Tolly, refuse to give Napoleon the decisive battle he craves. Instead, they retreat, employing a scorched earth policy. They burn villages, destroy crops, and poison wells, leaving nothing for the advancing French to forage. The Grande Armée's supply lines, already stretched to their breaking point, begin to fry. Disease, particularly typhus, and desertion start to thin the ranks far more effectively than any Russian musket. The summer heat is brutal, and the dust kicked up by hundreds of thousands of marching feet and hooves chokes the men and horses. The glorious march to Moscow is quickly turning into a grueling, demoralizing slog. By September, the French are nearing Moscow. The new Russian commander, the aging but beloved Mikhail Kutuzov, knows he must make a stand to save the city and national honor. The two colossal armies clash at the village of Borodino. What follows is one of the bloodiest single days of the entire Napoleonic Wars. It's a tactical slugfest, a brutal, head-on collision of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The French artillery roars, tearing gaping holes in the Russian lines. The Russian cannons answer in kind. Men charge into a whirlwind of canister shot and musket balls. The Great Redoubt, a massive Russian earthwork, becomes the epicenter of the slaughter, changing hands multiple times in a desperate struggle. By the end of the day, the battlefield is a nightmarish landscape of over 70,000 casualties. The French technically win. The Russians retreat, but their army is not destroyed. Napoleon himself calls it the most terrible of all his battles. He has his victory, but at a cost that will haunt him. A week after Borodino, Napoleon enters Moscow. He expects a delegation of city elders to surrender the keys to the city, as it happened in Vienna, Berlin, and other European capitals. But the city is eerily silent. It's a ghost town. Most of its population has fled. Napoleon sets up his headquarters in the Kremlin, waiting for the Tsar's surrender. But the surrender never comes. Instead, that very night, fires break out across the city. Set by Russian patriots, the fires are fanned by strong winds, and soon, Moscow is an inferno. 4 days, the city burns. Napoleon watches from the Kremlin as his grand prize turns to ash and rubble. The fire destroys what little supplies and shelter remained. The Grande Armée is now camped in a ruined city, hundreds of miles deep in hostile territory, with a relentless Russian winter fast approaching. Napoleon waits in Moscow for 5 long weeks. He sends peace offers to Tsar Alexander, but they are met with defiant silence. The Tsar knows his greatest ally is about to arrive, genital winter. As the first snowflakes begin to fall in mid-October, a grim reality sets in for Napoleon. He cannot stay in Moscow. The army is starving, its logistical situation is catastrophic, and the Russian army is regrouping. Not to mention the partisans and Cossacks, who harass French patrols and supply convoys relentlessly. The decision is made. The retreat must begin, but it's already too late. On October 19th, the once mighty Grande Armée, now laden with loot from the city but desperately short on food and winter clothing, begins its long, agonizing march back west. They have no idea of the true horror that awaits them. The initial plan is to retreat via a more southerly route, one untouched by the earlier scorched earth policy, where they might find food and forage. But Kutuzov's revitalized Russian army blocks their path at the town of Malor. A fierce battle ensues, and while the French manage to take the town, the cost is high. More importantly, the battle convinces Napoleon that the southern route is too risky. He makes a fateful, catastrophic decision: to retreat back along the same devastated route they had advanced on. Desmoulins-Vilnius Road, a path already stripped bare of all resources. a path that would become a frozen highway to hell. Now, the true enemy reveals itself. It's not just the Russian army, but the cold. The temperature plummets. -20, -30 degrees Celsius. These soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, begin to freeze to death. The ground becomes a sheet of ice, making it impossible for the horses, already starving, to keep their footing. Without horses to pull the cannons and supply wagons, they are abandoned by the roadside, one by one. The army's artillery and logistical train disintegrate. Men discard their weapons, their discipline, their very humanity. It becomes a desperate scramble for individual survival. Food runs out completely. Men resort to eating the frozen carcasses of dead horses, sometimes even their dead comrades. Frostbite claims fingers, toes, and noses. Hypothermia turns sleeping men into frozen statues. The Cossacks and Russian partisans are like wolves shadowing a dying herd. They swarm any small group that falls behind, any straggler too weak to keep up. They show no mercy. The retreat becomes a continuous, running battle against hunger, cold, and a relentless enemy. The once proud Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite, now acts as his personal bodyguard, marching in a hollow square around him, protecting the emperor from the chaos he has unleashed. The Grande Armée is no longer an army. It's a shambling column of ghosts, a river of misery flowing through a barren, white wasteland. Each step is a struggle, each mile marked by the frozen bodies of the fallen. One of the most infamous episodes of the retreat occurs at the Berezna River. The main bridges have been destroyed by the Russians, who are now closing in from multiple directions to trap and annihilate what is left of Napoleon's force. It looks like the end, but in a final, brilliant display of engineering and military grit, Napoleon's Dutch pontooniers, working in the freezing water, managed to construct makeshift bridges. What follows is a desperate, chaotic crossing. The army proper pushes across, fighting off Russian attacks from both banks, but behind them, a massive crowd of camp followers, civilians, and disorganized stragglers. Panics. They surge onto the fragile bridges, which eventually break under the strain. Thousands are crushed in the stampede, fall into the icy river, or are cut down by the arriving Russians. The Berezna crossing is a tactical success that saves the core of the army, but it's a human catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. After the Berezna, the retreat dissolves into a complete rout. The cold intensifies even further. Napoleon, realizing the army is lost and hearing of a potential coup back in Paris, decides he must leave. On December 5th, he hands over command to Marshal Murat and speeds away in a sleigh, racing back to France to raise a new army and save his empire. His departure is a final, crushing blow to the morale of the remaining soldiers. They feel abandoned. The final few thousand survivors, haggard, frostbitten, and barely human, finally stumble across the Niemen River and out of Russia in mid-December. Of the over 600,000 men who had marched into Russia just 6 months earlier, fewer than 100,000 made it out, and of those, only a fraction were still fit for combat. The 1812 campaign was more than just a military defeat. It was an apocalypse. It shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. It bled the French Empire of its finest soldiers and its irreplaceable cavalry, losses from which it would never fully recover. The disaster in Russia emboldened Napoleon's enemies across Europe. Prussia, Austria, and Sweden soon joined Russia and Britain in a new coalition. The War of the Sixth Coalition, the war that would ultimately lead to Napoleon's downfall and exile, had begun. The long march from Moscow was the beginning of the end for the Napoleonic Empire, a chilling testament to the dangers of hubris and the unforgiving power of the Russian winter. Thank you for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. See you next time. Welcome back, history lovers. Last time, we left Napoleon's Grande Armée just as it began its long, treacherous march out of a burning Moscow. The dream of a swift victory was gone, replaced by the grim reality of survival. Today, we're diving deeper into the nightmare that was the retreat from Moscow, a military catastrophe of epic proportions. As the French army trudged west, the Russian winter, the infamous General Winter, was just beginning to stir. Snow started to fall, temperatures plummeted, and the once mighty army found itself woefully unprepared. Soldiers had discarded their heavy winter gear during the summer march, expecting a quick campaign. Now, they were wrapped in whatever they could find. Women's shawls, priestly vestments, even scraps of carpet anything to ward off the biting cold. The magnificent uniforms were reduced to tattered rags. Frostbite became as deadly an enemy as any Russian soldier, claiming fingers, toes, and even lives as men froze to death in their sleep. The supply situation was beyond dire. The scorched earth policy of the retreating Russian army meant there was nothing to forage. The French were starving. Horses, vital for pulling cannons and supply wagons, were the first to go. They were slaughtered for their meat, leaving artillery pieces and crucial supplies abandoned on the roadside. The desperate soldiers ate whatever they could find: roots, tree bark, and even, in the darkest moments, their fallen comrades. This wasn't just a retreat. It was a desperate scramble for survival, where the bonds of discipline and brotherhood began to fray under the immense strain of hunger and cold. And then there were the Cossacks. These fierce, irregular cavalrymen were the ghosts of the Russian plains. They never engaged in a full-scale battle, but were a constant, harassing presence. They would appear out of a snow squall, strike the vulnerable flanks and rear of the French column, and vanish just as quickly. They picked off stragglers, captured supply wagons, and instilled a constant sense of fear and paranoia. For the exhausted and starving soldiers of the Grande Armée, the cry of Cossacks was a death knell. Every step was fraught with danger, not just from the elements, but from a relentless, unseen enemy. One of the first major hurdles was the Battle of Motivational. Napoleon had hoped to retreat via a southern route through untouched territory, where his army might find food and supplies. But the Russian army, under the command of the wily Marshal Kutuzov, blocked his path. The town changed hands 8 times in a single day of brutal house-to-house fighting. While the French technically won the battle, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Kutuzov had forced Napoleon back onto the same ravaged road they had used to advance on Moscow. There was no hope of finding sustenance there. It was a strategic masterstroke by the Russians. Sealing the fate of the Grande Armée, they were now condemned to march back through a barren wasteland of their own making. The retreat became a long, agonizing procession of death. The road was littered with the frozen bodies of men and horses, abandoned cannons, and discarded equipment. The army disintegrated into a horde of desperate individuals, each focused only on their own survival. The rear guard, commanded by the heroic Marshal Ney, fought a series of desperate battles to hold back the pursuing Russians, earning him the nickname the bravest of the brave. And as leadership was one of the few glimmers of light in this dark chapter, as he and his men sacrificed themselves to allow the main body of the army to escape. As the remains of the army staggered towards the city of Smolensk, they held on to a sliver of hope. They believed massive stockpiles of food, clothing, and ammunition awaited them there. Smolensk was meant to be their salvation. But when the first starving soldiers stumbled into the city, they found chaos. The supply depots were poorly organized and were quickly overwhelmed and looted by the desperate, undisciplined mob. The hope that had sustained them through weeks of horror evaporated. There was no relief in Smolensk, only more despair. The retreat had to continue, deeper into the heart of the unforgiving winter. Perhaps the most infamous and dramatic moment of the entire retreat was the crossing of the Berezna River. The Russian armies were closing in from 3 sides, aiming to trap and annihilate what was left of Napoleon's forces. The original bridges had been destroyed. It seemed like the end, but in a stunning feat of engineering and courage, Napoleon's Dutch engineers, the Pontoniers, worked waist-deep in the freezing, icy water to build makeshift bridges. They worked tirelessly, many of them freezing to death where they stood, to create a path to safety. The crossing was a scene of pure chaos. While the combat troops and the Imperial Guard crossed in a relatively orderly fashion, the massive crowd of stragglers, civilians, and camp followers panicked. They surged onto the flimsy bridges, which groaned under the weight. Russian artillery began to shell the crossing, adding to the terror. People were trampled, pushed into the icy river, and crushed by wagons. It was a horrific bottleneck of human desperation. When the French rear guard finally set fire to the bridges to prevent the Russians from following, thousands were still left stranded on the eastern bank, abandoned to their fate. The Berezina was a tactical victory in that Napoleon and the core of his army escaped, but it was a human tragedy of unimaginable scale. The name Berezina entered the French language as a synonym for disaster. After the Berezina, the retreat descended into its final, most ghastly phase. The temperature dropped to its lowest point, reportedly as cold as -37 degrees Celsius. Organized military units almost ceased to exist. It was simply a stream of frozen, skeletal figures shuffling through the snow. On December 5th, with the army just a few days from friendly territory, Napoleon made a controversial decision. He left the army and sped ahead to Paris by sleigh and carriage. He argued he needed to return to France to raise a new army and stabilize his political situation. To his critics, it was an act of abandonment. To his supporters, it was a necessary political move to save his empire. Marshal Murat was left in command, but he too would soon depart, leaving Eugene de Beauharnais, and finally Marshal Ney, to lead the last survivors out of Russia. Of Timouritan, 400,000 soldiers who had entered Russia with the main army. Fewer than 40,000 staggered across the Niemen River and back into Poland and Prussia. The once invincible Grande Armée had been effectively destroyed, not by a single decisive battle, but by cold, starvation, and 1,000 small cuts. The 1812 campaign was a turning point. It shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and bled his empire of its finest soldiers. The losses were so catastrophic that he could never fully recover. The nations of Europe, seeing his weakness, rose up against him in the War of the Sixth Coalition, which would ultimately lead to his downfall and exile. The retreat from Moscow stands as one of history's most powerful and chilling warnings about the dangers of hubris, the brutal power of nature, and the immense human cost of war. It's a story of ambition, disaster, and the desperate, tragic struggle for survival against impossible odds. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into the Napoleonic Wars fascinating, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical deep dive. See you next time.